Welcome everyone to Millions of Conversations' first Conversationalist Series for this year, 2021. For those of you in the United States, I hope you're enjoying our snow week, which we're experiencing. Most of us are experiencing, including Texas. And for Professor Chicktay in South Africa, we miss your summer weather right now. And thank you again for joining us in what is your prime evening time. Conversationalists. Thank you, Ali. Thank you. Conversationalists, we're excited to curate this first event in our 2021 series with our partners at Vanderbilt. I'd like to just briefly introduce them as well and give a big thank you to them, starting with Associate Chaplain Reverend Gretchen Pearson over at Vanderbilt's Chaplain's Office, Professor Elizabeth Meadows at the Robert Penn Warren Center for the Humanities, and the Director of Vanderbilt's Global Education Office, Eric Onstead. Thank you again to the three of you and your teams for helping make this event possible today. And Conversationalists, what we'll, thank you. Zoom gives that a little bit of that awkward pause, right? And Conversationalists, we will be doing effectively three things together over the next hour. First, we will be learning about the limits and possibilities of truth and reconciliation work. Second, and in this process, we will be watching for 30 minutes, two professionals model how to have a difficult and emotionally charged conversation that for some will be perceived to be riddled with controversy. Through this process, they will be demonstrating also the power of listening. This is also, by the way, the first time that both Professor Chicktay and Professor Crayton have even met. And this is also, therefore, the first time they will be having this conversation. And third, we will invite all of you to join us in a breakout room session for the last 20 minutes, where you can discuss your observations with your fellow conversationalists and also discuss how to model, how to have these conversations within your home communities and how to use the art of listening as the first step in the process towards realizing sustainable peace in America. We will be providing you with also a take-home toolkit that you can review after this event. Mary Tezak will be dropping it in the chat box several times throughout the event today. Also, recognizing the chat box, please feel free to drop questions and comments along the way. Beginning now with our model discussion, with our two esteemed colleagues here, it is my honor to introduce our guests, Professor Kareem Crayton and Professor Chicktay. I will begin with Professor Kareem Crayton. Dr. Crayton's scholarly research centers on the intersection of law, politics, and race. He is the only academic in the United States in law and political science whose principal work explores the relationship between race and politics in representative institutions. He has served on faculties across the country, including Harvard University, the University of Alabama, and most recently, Vanderbilt University. For the last 2 years, Dr. Crayton led a public interest social justice law firm as it prepared for 2 landmark Supreme Court voting rights cases. A native of Montgomery, Alabama, Dr. Crayton is a magna cum laude graduate of Harvard University, and he holds a PhD in political science as well as a law degree from Stanford University. Most recently, Dr. Crayton has been working with us here at Millions of Conversations as a senior policy advisor to help us think through and develop the beginnings of a blueprint for what a national truth and reconciliation effort across the United States could look like. For those of you familiar with the Millions of Conversations model, you will note that this is step 6, the next to last step in our process towards transcending divides and realizing sustainable peace in America today. The process starts with the first step, the pledge to listen, which is the current step that we are currently in. Our ambition is that this will lead to humanization, which then moves us towards empathy. And then that moves us to the next step, which is exploring common values, which is followed by a commitment to living a shared future together, which is then followed by the step 6, by arguably, which is the hardest step of all, truth and reconciliation. If done successfully, we believe that truth and reconciliation work leads us to the final step, sustainable peace. As we go through this cycle that replaces negative norms with positive norms, we find that in the short term, this work also disrupts cycles, those cycles that lead to fear, hate, and violence, and replaces those negative cycles with positive norms. You will find out more about all of this in your take-home listening guide toolkit that Mary will be providing. To help us understand what has worked and what has not worked in a country that has been through this now for decades, Professor Alli Chicktay is joining us from South Africa. Dr. Mohamed Alli Chicktay is an academic at the University of Witwatersrand, where his research focuses on constitutional law, alternative dispute resolution law, and labor law. He has completed 4 law degrees, including a PhD at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa, and he also studied mediation and negotiations at Harvard. On several topics of interest, including our topic today, he has published extensively in accredited South African and international law journals and presented conference papers in a number of countries, including India, Malaysia, Greece, England, and South Africa. He has advised and built capacity on extensive mediation and arbitration trainings to legal professionals, judges, academics, and parliamentarians from Kenya, Uganda, Nigeria, Botswana, Malawi, Tanzania, Zambia, South Africa, and most recently, mediators for the Lesotho's High Court. Dr. Chicktay is also currently the chairperson of the South African Companies Tribunal and a commissioner with the South African Broadcast Complaints Commission. Professor Chicktay and Professor Crayton, thank you again for being with us today. In the interest of you both modeling a difficult conversation that runs deeply personal for you both, and to which you have had both professional and personal opinions about, I'm going to ask the first series of questions here in the hope that you can then continue this conversation between each other for the next 30 minutes. Some of the questions that I'd like to just ask to help get the conversation started here include, ladies and gentlemen, we hear a lot these days about accountability in America, truth and reconciliation. Professor Chicktay and Professor Crayton, when you hear those words, what do they mean to you, both professionally and also personally? And what is the supposed role of truth and reconciliation commissions? Do you think truth and reconciliation processes work? Can it work here in the United States? Did it work in South Africa? What are the limits and what are the possibilities? Professor Crayton, you talk a lot about the role of representative institutions and how truth and reconciliation fits. Please tell us more about your point of view on this. And please feel free to ask Professor Chicktay any questions as well from his experience about this in South Africa. And Professor Chicktay, you recently remarked to me in conversation that you aren't so sure that South Africa would have the same results today as it did 15 to 20 years ago. Would love to hear more about your thoughts on this statement and any questions you have for us as you observe our current state from the tip of Africa where you were born and raised. Professor Crayton, let us start with you.
Well, thank you, Summer, or I should say now Professor Alli, for the introduction and the invitation to speak. And it's a real delight to be in this conversation. I want to start small and really welcome the engagement on all of these levels. As some of you know, I actually, in addition to having worked in the United States a lot, have a little bit of a tie to South Africa, having clerked on the Constitutional Court there. It is a place that has special connection, partly because of what I study, but also just the experience there that I really treasure. On the point about the meaning of truth and reconciliation, I think my experience there is so meaningful in part because I saw, in some ways, the fruits of that process. Limited though it was, what I thought was really important that wasn't true in the place where I grew up, Montgomery, Alabama, was at the time a real accounting of facts. And it wasn't as though these facts weren't known to people. Within communities, say the Black neighborhood that I grew up in, everybody understood different things that were not happy chapters in Montgomery's experience that account for sort of why things were the way that they were in the 1980s. But that wasn't something that was spoken about publicly, certainly not in what we would describe as mixed company. And for my experience, I think that one first step of truth and reconciliation is to actually have a shared set of facts. And I've said this in other places, you can't have alternative facts or substitute facts. A shared set of facts is sort of a starting point. And how we get there, obviously, involves some difficult work where people share experiences and get to a point where through these differences, we can establish a set of observable, verifiable, one might dare say even objective facts about things that happen. You know, the hard work goes beyond that about why they happen and what might be done about it. But the shared set of facts to me is a sort of fundamental. And I thought, at least as an outsider coming to South Africa, one thing that was comparatively better than what I had experienced in growing up is some understanding of what the circumstances of the prior regime produced and why it was problematic. And I feel like we in the American system are just coming to grips with, frankly, Reconstruction, right? We're having a crash course on what happened at the end of the 19th century and seeing in some ways the ramifications now. So it concerns me that we have a lot of catching up to do, but it seems to be that's a starting point. Does it work? I guess we are about to find out, but I think maybe that's a point to stop and hear some from the South African perspective about maybe that or anything else, if that's all right.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Firstly, thank you, Summer and Millions of Conversations for having this platform to hear our perspectives as one South African. I think it's an important conversation. And as I say, one South African, because you may hear different views from different South Africans on whether the TRC was successful or not. It depends on what we mean by success. It depends on who you're talking about. From a South African perspective, I think we're in a time politically where it was possible to have a TRC. And I always think of our TRC model as something compared to, let's say, post-World War II Nuremberg trials. I mean, they were able to have Nuremberg trials to have justice because you had a victor and you had a loser. And in South Africa in 1990, the early 1990s, when they were negotiating a settlement, the apartheid regime would not have agreed to go into a Nuremberg type of situation if they were, and it would have prevented us from reaching a settlement. And for me, it was a political compromise that had its time. And without it, we would have probably ended up with a revolution or a continued revolution and much more bloodshed. So in so many ways, it was a compromise of truth and reconciliation. For some people, they wanted to see the apartheid government pay for the human rights violations that they committed. I mean, they treated people inhumanely, you know. I mean, because of the color of your skin, you can't marry someone else. You can't live certain places. You are given what they call Bantu education to prevent you from reaching your full mental capacity so that you don't challenge the apartheid state. And for those, the TRC wasn't something to rejoice, but it was something that one had to compromise on together with a number of other things. I'm not saying it wasn't valuable. I think we're able to, for others, I mean, for some, we were able to achieve the stories. I know, Kareem, you talk about having common facts, but sometimes those facts would only come out from those stories that we hear at the TRC. So for some people, they learned about where their children were killed. They learned about what atrocities were being done, but it gave them some form of finality. It may not necessarily have given them a sense of justice to the extent that they saw the perpetrators go to jail, but they were able to hear what happened to their children. And it was an emotional thing. It was extremely emotional. So I think it has its pros and cons. It was a compromise that came about because of the political events that were available at the time. And they sold it as a form of reconciliation. And to some extent, they did their best they could to get some form of reconciliation. Because if you tell the truth, you get amnesty. And then you had F.W. de Klerk, the president of the National Party, and P.W. Botha. I mean, number of people. I mean, F.W. de Klerk got amnesty, came to speak there. You have people such as Biko's family who were against the system because it allowed for the killers of Biko to get away. I mean, so it depends who you speak to, you know, and in our history, maybe it was the right time to have that. You don't have a perpetrator and a victim. I mean, it's in the American system, it's maybe more difficult to define who's the perpetrator, who's the victim. I don't know. I mean, maybe it's easier, but it's not as easy as the South African system. Identifying the apartheid regime as perpetrators was much more easier. So maybe from your circle, maybe if you want to establish a TRC as someone looking at it from outside America, what are you looking for there for the TRC? I know America's had a number of TRCs in the past, but a national one, what is it that you're trying to achieve? For me, what is the ultimate goal with the TRC? For us, it was a form of a transition. And it was together with other things, reconciliation, rebuilding, the whole lot of other plans are put in place. Whether we succeeded or not, that's another question. What is the aim of having a national American TRC? What's the ultimate goal? Whose truth are we going to look at? How are we going to get buy-in from all Americans? For us, we see America as divided from outside, but maybe put the question to you. What is the ultimate goal? How do you see the TRC model? Maybe it's at the infancy stages yet, but maybe your perspective on that.
Very good question, Ali. And I think as you describe it, I think Americans would also be mixed about what one wants to get out of a process like Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But I do think what you said about facts and in some ways the solace in understanding what happened is really a shared feature of what I think most people, at least in the United States, would want a piece of. Now, whether that's all of the reason why, open question. But I do think that, you know, I think of one example, and this, you know, isn't necessarily, well, I guess in some ways it is about power. I think for the long period of time that there was this whole question as to the relationship between Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. And I say relationship in quotation marks, right? Whether there was any connection that produced children. That's a fact. And it took us, you know, to come to DNA technology to understand that and what that meant about the fact that Thomas Jefferson owned Sally Hemings. A painful fact, but something that ties in a big question about how we understand Thomas Jefferson, right? That is the person that framed many of the philosophies that underlie our system of government, who, as a person, did some things that we would clearly find abhorrent, right? But we have to hold all those thoughts in our heads at the same time. That's just one clear example. But that was denied until we got to a space where we could figure that out. Now, there are many other examples where I think the truth of things opens the door to harder conversations. But I do think I wanted to point to your frame about transition. That's a really crucial piece. I think it is really important for people to understand that it's not a process just for the sake of the process, right? It's a door into something more. And I agree, in South Africa, obviously, it was a different form of governance. And having people understand how to take account for what happened before and how not to do that, but then also to start thinking creatively about what that new thing was. So in the United States, we don't have, right, that same kind of transition. But it is true that our country is changing in ways that we aren't going to be able to really stop, even if some people do want to. And that's a demographic shift, right? Our country is rapidly changing, not just from urban to rural to urban, not just from one region, the Northeast to the Sun Belt, but also demographically, right? We have people who don't look like the United States did at the crafting of a constitution, right? Let alone the relationships that existed at the time. So what do we do about that? We can retrench, or we can think creatively, include everyone in the conversation, and see what happens. It is a risky thing, and it's really not something that has ever happened before in the United States, to be frank about it. That is, the people who talk about what power dynamics look like. I'm fast forwarding in where we're talking about in this process. But if we get to a point where we're talking about power dynamics, there's never been a case where people who are affected are the people who are at the table or representatives of those people, right? The deals often get cut on the backs of people who are affected. That's been most of the American story. How do we do that in a way that the people who all have skin in the game are all a part of the conversation? That's, I think, what is at stake with a truth and reconciliation process in this country. And I think an early part of that form has to be taking account of facts. But since you asked me a question, let me ask you one. I know one of the real challenges in the South African process, as people look back on it, is about the material transfer of goods so that they become more accessible to more people. As you look at it now, is there something that could have been done to make that intended distribution, widening of, right, the wealth opportunity more available to people? Or is this, part of the almost inevitable, some might say, method of moving from a state where a few had and many people had not, to something that looks different, but it's just a slow move towards wider opportunity?
Thank you for that. I think that's a good question. I think you're basically asking whether there could have been a transfer of economic power. I mean, one of the reasons for the apartheid system was to ensure that economic wealth was in the hands of a minority white community at the expense of the Black community, who, through the exploitation of mines and through and other resources that South Africa had to follow. And I think that's one of the criticism. I mean, I think when the Constitution was drafted, it was drafted with the aim of not just, as I said, the truth and reconciliation was there together with other aspects. Reconstruction and development was one aspect. BEE, creating a Black economic empowerment, was another aspect of creating. More than 20 years later, we still see the economic divide. There's a creation of a Black middle class, but a small Black middle class, and majority of Black communities still economically deprived. Could we have done things differently? It's a difficult question to answer. I mean, if we did things differently, that doesn't necessarily mean that we could have done away with the TRC. Maybe the economic programs could have been very different. Also, we live within a global economy. Government to decide to, nationalize mines and then ensure there's greater distribution for social benefits would become a pariah state. Would become like Zimbabwe to some extent. So I'm not sure if there's an alternative that we could have done with regard to. I think maybe we should have done more with regard to transferring economic power, because handing political power without economic power doesn't necessarily change the lives of a lot of South Africans who still live without water and electricity. And looking back 20 years later, I suppose that the new government's also made its own mistakes with increased corruption and those things. But looking back at the TRC model, and I think the important point that you made, a very important point, and I think is the word inclusiveness. And I think that's a critical point. People need to feel part of the country in some extent. And in South Africa, if people are economically deprived, you don't feel part of the whole. And I think in a lot of countries, you see it in Europe and you see it in America. And if you feel isolated, you have the tendency to become a bit more nationalist. You have a tendency to maybe blame immigrants and others who are not necessarily at fault for your flight. So you can't just have truth and reconciliation without having a plan to include those who have been marginalized. Those who have been marginalized may sometimes be the perpetrators. In many cases, they may even be the victims and the perpetrators. I mean, people become perpetrators and nationalistic maybe because it's easier to target those groups. So in South Africa, you have new political parties that have been established. The traditional ANC, while it's still in power, you have more parties on the right, more parties on the left. And as an outsider looking at America, we also see some of those tendencies, you know. And so I think the TRC, two important points I hear what you're saying. One is you need to have those stories from the people who are affected. And secondly, we need to have a broader sense of, a broader program to include those, not just coming up with the stories, but some form of economic development so that their voices are heard, so that they feel part of the community. And I think that's an important aspect of us listening to those communities. Sometimes we talk as academics and others and having these forums, but the people who are affected don't get those platforms. And maybe the TRC provides them with those platforms, and maybe it's a starting point for us to hear those stories. But I think it has to be part of a bigger plan. I mean, you say America is divided. When South Africa was divided initially, they had a government of national unity with the ANC and the apartheid government in one. I mean, do you think you could have a government of national unity with the Democrats and Republicans joining in one government? Maybe I'll put that really question to you to start reconciling.
Heck of a question. And I'll start there, work back, because I think you said a number of really interesting things I want to engage with. But right now, it is very difficult to see that, to your point. You know, you would have thought an insurrection at the seat of government that was violent, where people were killed, would be the moment, much like 9/11, where at least for a brief period, you'd see some coming together around even a small set of things. And that doesn't look like that, right? We, you know, in certain spaces are trying to take account of what happened. And that looks very politicized in ways that we've seen in every other policy question that have come up. So not soon. And that actually, to me, is a signal or piece of evidence that suggests, as I would think about it, that this in America is probably too big a country, perhaps, or perhaps at a moment where the discussion at the national level in institutions like Congress is exactly the wrong place to have this deep conversation. So whereas in South Africa, I mean, I know there are a lot of different, you know, spaces where this conversation happened, but, you know, moments on national television where people would, you know, deliver testimony, powerful testimony. I'm not sure we're there, and I'm not sure that we can get there in the near future, but that doesn't mean that, right, these opportunities don't exist in communities. And, you know, it sort of fits America's sort of federalist style anyway, where we want to give, you know, room for local and state government and communities to kind of differ. And I think that actually will matter, because the American story is a multitude of them. And that's a good thing. I want to connect what you just said to about material goods and economic reform to this discussion too, because what has happened at the national level is a discussion, and actually in the media as well, about reparations as being one form of, right, what reconciliation could look like. And I think, regardless of what you think about that question, the important piece that I thought you offered in the discussion about what truth and reconciliation can provide is a process by which people can adopt language that allows them to convey wants and desires about material distribution, right? That is, if there are people who think, well, my personal plight is mine and mine alone, right? You could get further marginalized and dejected from a larger conversation. But when you see other people, right, perhaps that look like you, perhaps that don't, share this common concern about, you know what, I've not been able to, for example, get healthcare that actually changes my life. That actually creates the seed for some broader coalition building, for one, but two, a language that might be used in the government space to change things. But I think that kind of conversation can happen not just with the policy questions like healthcare, but on big questions like jobs, land ownership, housing. Those sorts of questions are big. But I think that in this country, having that bubble up from the sort of local is really important. And I should mention that doesn't mean that it's sort of separated from institutions. As many of you all know, we have mayors and county commissions who are very focused on getting stuff done because they're not always people who operate on the same partisan divide that you necessarily see at the national level. Becoming more common, but I do think that that is an aspiration that is sort of within reach right now, given where this country is. But as to your question about a national party, that's a not soon. I'm not saying never, but I'm saying not soon. So I guess the other question that was there, like, what do we think are the possibilities of truth and reconciliation? I guess I would offer, my brief thought that so much of this is based on the people who are in the room. I often say this in comparative common law class when I talk about South Africa. So much of it the Constitution looks at other modern democracies and how they crafted norms, and in some ways says, yep, we're not doing that. And it looks, if you're looking at it from an American perspective, as sort of out of sorts from what might be considered normal. And I say normal with the quotation, scare quotes around it. But it worked for, at least as I think about it, it worked for the people who were in the room. And that's often what I think about truth and reconciliation. It doesn't always look pretty, nor does it maybe even look rational from the outside looking in. But sometimes it's driven by the people who need a certain set of things done. I wonder, is that different from your perspective? I'd love to hear how you think about, imperfect though it is, the way truth and reconciliation worked from your vantage point.
Look, from a South African perspective, I think we're fortunate in the timing of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It also depends on who runs it. And I think we had two iconic figures running it at the time. We had Nelson Mandela, who was the president, and we had Bishop Desmond Tutu, who was in charge of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And I think there were two iconic figures. I mean, you need people who are, they're not going to be trusted by everyone, but they were able to meet the support of majority of South Africans. So we were fortunate to have those two people there to give some form of legitimacy to the Truth and Reconciliation and to what we were doing. Those who supported the ANC and the liberation movement obviously supported Mandela and Desmond Tutu, and the apartheid regime was initially hesitant, but with the caliber of those people, they were able to get their support. So I think that was important for us when we had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Thinking about the American one, if you're going to have a national one, I don't know if you thought about who could lead that type of Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Who has the support of all Americans, or majority of Americans?
My answer probably would be Dolly Parton. That's about, and that's not just because that's not a tip of the hat simply to carry favor in Tennessee, but there aren't that many people in the political space who do. I mean, at this point, if you think about political figures, I can't name a former president that isn't considered by somebody a lightning rod. Jimmy Carter, maybe, but only because I think he's far enough away from the field in terms of leading as a politician to curry it. But I don't know. I think maybe actually someone like Dolly Parton, which seems like something that doesn't make any sense because there's nobody like Dolly Parton, who can pull people away from their normal thinking of they're in this box and therefore I either have to like them or I don't like them, to just get people to say stop and say, well, this is something we should at least take seriously on its own merits before we get into the pushing and pulling. I was trying to think of a religious leader these days who might fit that category. And again, because unfortunately our politics is so heavily informed by, and I don't mean religion as such, but the relationship between religious leaders, some of them, and political actors, they become in many ways just as polarized. But it's a tough thing. But I think, to me, the genius of that move in South Africa was basically an actor, a national figure, put their political capital behind a process. And even if you had doubts about the process, you understood that, you know, your hope and confidence in this person to succeed was what got you in the room or got you looking at it. I don't know who that is. And that may, again, be, I should say, as a national figure, hard to come by outside of Dolly Parton. But at the local level, I think these people exist because there are people who have reputations and credibility with, you know, neighborhoods and communities who do work and who, you know, aren't doing it for fame and aren't doing it for the likes on Twitter from the people that they like, or to flame the other side. I think that might be another reason why local spaces are the best to kind of start that. And maybe, and this often happens, right? National figures see something really smart that's occurring and they try to figure out how to support it. And I feel like that's the sort of space that civil society can take in order to kind of promote it and then to demonstrate to, you know, actors at the national and state levels, this can be done and people are buying into it. You just hope to heaven that they don't mess it up. But that's, I think your observation is really crucial and an important thing for us to think about as, you know, we're contemplating what that process could look like, what needs to happen, who do you go to start that thing or to verify, if you will, that idea. So is there any advice you would offer to the United States? I'm giving you at least my take on it. What are there thoughts you have based on your experience that you'd say, you know, do this or don't do this?
I think, thank you for that. I think some very insightful comments on, I think some important points from your side, and I'll then talk about what I think. Religion and the TRC, it's different. It's a strange thing because in reconciliation, we often think about religion, and the religion in South Africa had, I suppose, was done for good and also done for evil, I think, to some extent. I think religion was used to justify apartheid for a very strange reading of the Bible. And it was also used to the fight against apartheid by people like Desmond Tutu and a number of other religious groupings. And I think in America, we see a similar thing, sometimes people using religion to oppress others, and some excellent religious leaders fighting for fundamental rights. So I don't know. And in our TRC, we had Desmond Tutu together with a number of other reverends. So I'm not sure how you're going to play that out. With regard to the advice to America, it's quite difficult because the only thing I can have is questions. I mean, our TRC was based on people who committed political atrocities. What is your TRC going to be about? Are you going to have a separate one for, let's say, Black Lives Matter versus the political conflicts between Democrats and Republicans? Maybe they're very intertwined. And maybe your point about having smaller groupings is a better one because it's just too big to start at the beginning. It's tough, but my advice would be, I suppose, to listen to those who are affected and hear their viewpoints, those who've been victims, the families of those victims. Because reading up about American TRCs, I've read a few things, and many of them got a lot out of it. They were given an opportunity to tell their stories. And sometimes no one listens to you, you know? And at least someone's giving them a chance to listen to your story. So I would say, go to the ground, figure out what's troubling people, and maybe do it small, as you say, and then start with the small communities and build up to something that's big. Or maybe take a theme. Let's talk about Black Lives Matter. Let's have that conversation. You know, as a South African, Black Lives Matter resonates a lot. I think it resonates globally, and it's taken on such a, I mean, it's become something that's extremely important, which we look at and say, look, you know, that bending on the knee before every sports event, it's not just a bend on the knee, it's saying, look, this is a real problem. a real problem in America, and as an outsider looking at America, and I've spent some time there as well. I don't know, the issues that we've seen over the last few years, I think need something. And I think it's commendable for people, for all of you here to be taking the effort to do something. But I think it's more than just truth and reconciliation. It's inclusiveness, inclusiveness in healthcare, inclusiveness in maybe land redistribution, inclusiveness in economic opportunities for people, the pursuit of happiness can't just be a line in the American Constitution. It should be a reality for you guys, in some ways, you'll set a role model or a landmark for the rest of us to look at. And I think South Africa resonates with that. We call ourselves the Rainbow Nation because of different cultures. We've got our own problems, but those cultures should be celebrated. That's what, America's a country of immigrants, people who've come together and done amazing things. And I think it's just getting back on the right track, started talking, listening to people. And I think people don't listen enough. And that's the problem. Everyone thinks they know. The media just talks and talks. Sometimes maybe we need to listen to each other, and and that's, my point of view from a South African perspective is it's broader than truth and reconciliation. It's inclusiveness of all Americans, irrespective of race, color, religion. And to get there, I think the TRC is a starting model, but I think you need an economic model as well, accompany that.
I love it. No. Thank you for that.
Thank you. I don't know if there's...
That was really powerful. No, thank you. And I know we're going to be going out into our breakout rooms, but I did want to give Professor Crayton just a minute to respond to that powerful statement and to help us conclude the conversation before we move into the breakout sessions. Thank you.
Well, Ali, let me just thank you for really offering really helpful ways of thinking about this and adding to my knowledge base about South Africa. I'm glad that we got an opportunity to meet now. Let me just throw in a couple of thoughts that you just made me kind of connect to some things that have been happening. As you say, there have been geographic spaces where sort of truth and reconciliation commissions have developed. And I think post 2020, there are some efforts that are starting in other kinds of communities that aren't necessarily geographic. I note here former colleague Sherilyn Eiffel, who's now running the Legal Defense Fund, who's written a great op-ed that at least encourages us, partly due to South Africa's experience, but to think about the way in which lawyers as a community have either contributed to our current circumstance or have been by either acting or by failing to act. And I think we can think of them, we can think of the media, as you really helpfully point out, as another community that needs to kind of go through a process of accounting, both internally how they manage things, but also, as your point, I think nicely highlights, what messages are getting shared with people, what behaviors are getting celebrated that come on our big screens or small screens about what's normal in public life. I think all of these places are great sites for this discussion and maybe give us these sort of innovative ideas that we can carry forward in other spaces. The thing I'll just say is I feel like more than anything, the crucial piece of this is to understand it's one part of the process, and that because, as you rightly say, some of this is going to involve the demonstration and illustration of pain and trauma. And what South Africans, I will say, I appreciated so much about that process was that people were careful and thoughtful about caring for people in that moment. And that in the midst of trying to share that pain, it is not for show, it is for the purpose of getting change. And so when you want to encourage people who have an experience with marginalization, exclusion, and trauma to engage in a process, it seems to me you at least have to say this is for a purpose. Some of it, of course, is cathartic, but it can't just be that, right? People have real material concerns and they gotta have an answer in this process to what happens next. And so when we do this, however we do it, I really hope people bear that in mind about what are we commencing to do once the hearing part is over. We can't just hear, we have to hear, learn, and then decide how we will act. What will we do differently so we don't do this again? To me, that's the most important part. And I know I've talked over 2 minutes, Summer, so I apologize.
No, I was going to say, and we have to listen, and that's exactly it. And I appreciate for both of you for bringing that up and for that driving that point home naturally too. So thank you. And the inclusivity piece is so important. And gosh, we could continue this conversation for, I could continue listening to you all for hours, quite frankly. And this is in part, this is the process. And these are the types of conversations we need to be having. Because of time, we're going to go ahead and break out into our breakout sessions. We'll give 15 minutes for those, and then we'll come back in. We're hoping that this again is the beginning of several conversations. But before we do break out, I just wanted to say thank you so much. Just want to clap to Professor Crayton and Professor Chicktay for an extraordinary conversation. It was so enriching to be a fly on the wall of your conversation. So thank you. And Mary will now take us to the breakout rooms. Well, hi, everyone. Welcome back. I know we're just a couple of minutes over. We do have, we did lose Professor Crayton, but we still, thankfully, thank you, Professor Chicktay, again for joining us and what is your evening time. We do have at Millions of Conversations 5 more minutes for those of you who want to stay on with us. And thank you, Mary, for sharing the listening guide for everyone to take home with them. I know we had a very intense conversation. We witnessed a very intense conversation here. And since we don't always have someone like Professor Chicktay with us, I did want to see if anybody who raised a question in the chat box during the conversation would like to pose a conversation to Professor Chicktay in our remaining 5 minutes.
I'm curious, if that's okay, about the immediacy of the atrocities committed by the apartheid regime in South Africa made the Truth and Reconciliation Commission function in a way that I struggled to see that it would be effective in the United States. You know, not to say that we don't continue to deal with racial injustices or systemic racism in our society, but the length of time that, I mean, we're talking about 400 years of terrible crimes and injustices without the possibility of accountability. Can we have an authentic truth and reconciliation conversation, I guess is my question.
Professor Chicktay, you're on mute. Yeah.
Is that for me? Yeah. Okay. I think you. Thank you for that question, Chris. I think you got to ask yourself, what do you mean by success? What is a successful Truth and Reconciliation Commission? I think that's an important question to ask yourself. Look, South Africa's. I mean, in school we were taught that the first person who came to South Africa was Jan van Riebeeck in 1652. You know, it's like no black people ever lived there before. So that was the colonial history we were taught, which is politically incorrect. But we've had atrocities since 1652. Since South Africa was established, there've been slavery in certain of the provinces, and there've been exploitation then. So it's not just the apartheid government that's committed the atrocities, and it has happened for quite a long time. But the TRC had a time frame within that. It depends what you want to do, because I think one of the issues that was brought up by Kareem was that the country may be too big to have a national Truth and Reconciliation Commission. You may want to have it on particular themes like Black Lives Matter. How far back you go with regard to that is another question you could ask yourself. But as I said, it depends on what you mean by success, because sometimes it's important for people to tell their stories, and for them, maybe it would be success. And you're going to have some people who say it's worked, for some it may not work. I don't know what model you're going to take up, but I do think it's going to have to be an American model. What South Africa does may be important for its culture and our history, But I think you guys need to think what's important and maybe work on certain themes and see the success of that and expand it. And I think you've got a precedent. There have been TRCs that have been used in the US in the past. So, and listening to the stories of people who spoke at, who were part of those TRCs were quite heartwarming and quite sad in a way as well. So there's a need for reconciliation in America, I think. A lot of people feel that they need it, and there's also a need for some form of economic transformation, I think, especially for marginalized communities. How you do it and what you do, you may have to start small, and you may have to at first identify what's meant by success. I don't know.
Very good advice. No, thank you, Professor Chicktay. And Chris, this is part of what we're going to be doing and building out at Millions of Conversations. So we would really welcome your questions and your thoughts and your suggestions. You can email us at info@millionsofconversations.com. Would love to follow up with you on this. And I just wanted to say, before we wrap up for everybody, I see, Alex, you do have your hand raised. If Professor Chicktay has a couple of minutes at the end to stay on after the session concludes, we can keep it open for a minute. But I did want to just conclude with a couple of reminders and thoughts. First of all, as we mentioned before, we have the Pledge to Listen take-home kit. I keep mentioning it because throughout 2020, lots of people asked us for a home take-home kit, a toolkit to take home so they can model these conversations at home. And so we worked on that so that in 2021, we can provide that to you. Please, again, keep the questions coming and keep the dialogue open with us. The second thing I wanted to say is the second event in our 2021 Conversationalist Series will be in Scott County, Tennessee, and it's going to be happening on March 18th. Mary can share with you the information. And it's going to be about the future of the South. And the conversation that we'll be having is going to be with people who are on different political sides of the aisle, but that's not the only piece of the discussion that we'll be highlighting. They'll be discussing education, mental health, addiction, race, and poverty at this level, at the county level, and thinking about how they come together to work on those issues, regardless of different political differences. And we've had a Future of the South event before, so this will be our second event on the future of the South. And then finally, just wanted to ask everyone to take the pledge to listen. If there's a common theme that's been running through the conversation today, it's been that we have to listen to each other, and that's how we become and we build our muscles to be inclusive with each other. So we'll ask everyone to please take that pledge to listen. And with that concludes our presentation and our event for today. I want to really thank everybody and stay in touch with us. We're looking forward to continuing this journey with you. And Professor Chicktay, do you have just a couple of minutes to stay on and answer Alex's question and anybody else who might want to hang on for a couple more minutes? I know we're imposing on your time, so if you have to conclude, then we can conclude.
No, it's fine. It's fine.
We'll do 3 minutes. Alex, go ahead, and then we'll wrap up.
Hi, Ali. Sorry about that.
No worries.
Yeah, I was just interested to know a bit more about because a lot of people talk about South Africa as a success story. But you're one of a few people to mention it actually as a compromise and perhaps quite a difficult one. So I was just wondering if you could elaborate that on a bit more, and then maybe if you have time as an extension to that, what lessons America can learn in terms of priming the right for a potential commission in America, because there's going to have to be compromises made. You can't get our ideal vision just straight through like that. It's never that easy. So yeah. That's my question.
Thank you.
Okay. Look, thank you, Alex. I started by saying, look, it depends who you speak to in South Africa, whether the TRC has succeeded or failed. It depends on what you mean by success. But it was, in many ways, a political compromise. I mean, many South Africans wanted the apartheid regime to face a criminal system, because what they did was a severe violation of human rights. It was very difficult for us to do that at the time, and therefore, because the apartheid government still had power. They still controlled the army. They still they were able to hold on for a while. And I also think, but I think from the apartheid government side, you got to look at it from a global perspective as well. The Soviet Union was in decline in the early 90s as well. South Africa played a strategic role in upholding, in the staving off the spread of communism in the south, whether in Mozambique and Angola. We fought a number of wars there. So while we were, while there was an apartheid state and people were crying out against the apartheid government, it suited a lot of Western interest to have the apartheid government there because it stifled the spread of communism. But once the USSR declined, was basically coming to an end in the early 90s, and that need for the apartheid state or serving a particular interest was not as pertinent as it was before. So there was an interest on the apartheid state to also come to some form of negotiated settlement, but I think they wouldn't have done so if they had to face some form of Nuremberg trials post apartheid. So the TRC model was part of a political compromise. And I think from the ANC side, they had people who could see the bigger picture, like Nelson Mandela. But obviously for some South Africans, Biko's family wanted the perpetrators to face atrocities that they had committed. So not all South Africans may see it as a success. But as I said, it has its pros and cons. It served a particular purpose. People were able to say their stories, and a lot of people found out what happened to their children. And sometimes, and what would the alternative would have been continued evolution, difficult to prosecute without evidence. So it's a type of compromise that we have to come to at the end of the day. So I'm not saying it's a failure. I'm just saying we got to look at the facts and the reality, and a lot of good has also come out from the TRC. And I think maybe that the good for Americans, maybe the idea of giving people an opportunity to speak and a platform to do that is something that's important, whether you have a national platform or a particular themed platform or within communities. At the end of the day, you're going to have to decide what works. But I think giving people a voice is important in a democracy. But I think you need to, as I said before, people have to be included. It's got to be part of a bigger picture. 20 years down the line, a lot of South Africans are still economically deprived. There's still a high rate of poverty that was created because of the apartheid system often. It intentionally created a system where blacks were marginalized and did not have the economic power. So, and America has a lot of marginalized communities. Black Lives Matter is not just about, it's about a lot of things, it's about being included, it's being part of America, you know. And I mean, it's a sad statement, Black Lives Matter. The fact that we have to say it, I mean, it's quite a powerful statement. And I think that inclusiveness is important. And you need a bigger program. TRC is not just about talking, that's important, but what's going to happen after that? Because now 20 years later in South Africa, people are still poor economically. Also high levels of corruption, there's other issues that have come into play, but yeah, so inclusiveness is important. How you do that, yeah, it's part of a bigger picture, I think. Thank you.
Wow. Professor Chicktay, thank you. Really, truly can't thank you enough. Your words of wisdom will stay with us for a very long time. So thank you. Thank you for all the work you're doing and you're doing in South Africa, across the continent and of Africa, around the world, and for caring about our future here in America.
Thank you for the invitation, Saman. Thank you, everyone, and I wish you all the best. And yeah, and Arik, we're waiting for your students to come to WITS and and anyone else's students. Thank you very much for spending your time with me as well. Appreciate it, all of you.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Till next time.